adequately represented in governance structures. Why do you think this is so? Why are we having this problem in Africa, Anita? Okay, so I don't think we have Anita yet. We will come back to her later. So I'm just going to turn to someone I have here in the studio, Bobi Wine, as an opposition leader and a former member of the parliament. What would you say are the political and economic barriers that prevent young Africans from formal political participation in your country and maybe even for the rest of Africa? And how have you been able to surmount them?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Greetings, viewers. I'll talk about Africa largely, but allow me to zoom in to Eastern Africa, and more particularly to Uganda, where I live. The challenges of Africa, Uganda in particular, is the generational divide, which is not only in age, but is also in mentality. And I'm very glad that you mentioned it, that we are stuck with 20th century mentality and leaders, and yet we are largely a 21st century population. We are stuck with leaders that have an old mentality and a mentality of authoritarianism. In Uganda, the problem, and I believe largely in Africa, is authoritarianism, where we have a leader that has been in power for 36 years. Unfortunately, even when the voices are raised, they are ignored or squashed with brutality. Now, this is a challenge. How we've been able to surmount them, I would not really be quick to say we've surmounted them. We've made the efforts, but the efforts have been crushed. And unfortunately, the development partners are not innocent to this. We really appreciate the attention that is put on Africa, but the attention and the statements alone do not cut the result. It is the action that we desire, and when that partnership is put in action, I strongly believe that Africa will be where it really deserves to be. I really believe that Africans, especially young Africans, will live to their full potential.
Thank you, Bobi Wine, for those very strong thoughts. The challenge of authoritarianism, and this is also, this goes hand in hand with a disappointment in governance from young people. I think it's a 2019 Mo Ibrahim Forum report that found that 60% of African, especially young people, think that their governments are doing a very bad job, or a fairly bad job, at addressing the needs of young people. I think in response to some of these authoritarianism trends in Africa, we've seen since 2010, a wave of peaceful protests across the continent. So my next question will go to Isa. It appears young Africans are speaking, especially, as Bobi Wine said earlier, but the governments are not listening. The leaders, the older generation are not listening to them. Why is the African youth voice not making a significant difference in governance? Why is it not being creating change despite the numbers that we have? Okay, we don't have Aisha, so I would ask you, Bobi, again to weigh in on this one.
Well, thank you very much. Africa has significantly suffered an attack on democracy and democratic principles. It has suffered an attack on human rights. It has suffered an attack on the rule of law. And like I said, while the authoritarian leaders in Africa are having their field day crushing democracy and crushing any alternative voices, particularly the young voices, it has not been made better by the development partners. I'm of the view that if the world listened and indeed acted to the values that bring us together as humanity, then Africa would live its full potential.
Thank you. We're looking at how Africa can live its full potential, but unfortunately, I don't think we can if we don't bridge this generational divide. But young people, have their own responsibility in this. And I think I would ask Ms. Kesani, if she's joined us, to address this issue, because despite being very vocal on social issues online, most young people dominate conversations on politics, on Twitter, on Facebook, and on all various social media platforms. But I'm conspicuously missing on election day. Why is that so, and what can be done for youth numbers to count in the polls and in the elections?
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. So this is rather a very subjective question to really ask because my voice doesn't necessarily represent the youth at large. But as someone, as a young person in South Africa who did not take part in the local government elections late November last year, we predominantly don't go to the polling stations because no matter what we say or what we fight for or the concerns we raise on social media, nothing changes. There is no youth representation in our government, right? And when I'm talking about youth representation, I'm talking about people that actually have the power and the influence, right, to change policies and decisions in our government. So representation is lacking so much. Our government has a tendency of doing things as tick box exercises. They will try and enact transformation policies or policies of any kind to ensure that they look like they are adhering to international standards, whereas they're actually not. And as someone that works in informal settlements, which are reached by poverty and inequality, nothing has changed. It's been 28 years into democracy, but people in informal settlements are still complaining or trying to get water and sanitation, just basic service delivery. So why should we as young people actually vote? I decide to not vote because it's not that I'm oppressed or I'm not allowed to vote, but it's a decision that I take as an individual to not vote. I take not voting as a protest of some sort that hopefully our government would use this time before the national elections in 2024 to actually reassess and reevaluate what's happening. Youth unemployment is very high. We've actually reached about 70% of youth unemployment in South Africa. Corruption continues to go up. No representation, no accountability, nothing actually works. So the youth is just being used as a tick box exercise, but we're actually not being put in positions of power, positions of influence, especially if you do not actually adhere to political standards in South Africa. If you speak out loud, you'll actually be excluded. So I think us not playing an active role in all of this is actually due to the fact that nobody listens. Nobody listens. So for how long are we going to protest? For how long are we going to withdraw our votes? So I think it's a good time now, especially for South Africa, leading up to the national elections in 2024, for them to actually reassess and have proper public participation, consultations with the youth, and actually ask, what is it that we want? Whatever approach they need to have a people-centered approach, which actually takes everything into consideration when they actually enact policy to ensure that we regain our faith and actually believe in everything that they're actually telling us or promising us for that matter.
Thank you, Ms. Kisani, for those comments. I'm just wondering, how, we're going to press for change if we are despondent, because I can hear a bit of despondence in her voice, and it's understandable, having shouted at the top of your voice and not been heard. There's a temptation to disconnect from the system. But let's hear a bit from our European partners here, and I would like to ask Eric, who's also joining us online, about this situation, how it's been experienced in Europe. Is not online?
Eric is with us. Yes, I'm here.
Oh my God, Eric. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So Eric, I'm glad I have you here, because I've lost a lot of my online speakers, but you're here and I'm happy you are. And you've been listening to this conversation we've been having about Africa and the generational gap. And I just want to have your take on, how Europe experiences different from Africa, and how, Europe is building capacity for young people to co-create solutions and co-lead with the older generation? And what lessons have you learned?
Merci d'abord de.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for welcoming here, not virtually, but physically. And thank you as well for the invitation to this discussion, which I think is essential for Africa, but also for all of the continents, and including the European continent. I'm a new member of the Development Committee in the Parliament, and I'm sure that some of the things I will say may be a little naive, and I prefer to say that before I speak. But what I see is that the question of young people and intergenerational issues, these are issues for Africa, and I'll come back to that, but they're also valid for Europe as well. And so perhaps the things we're talking about for Africa would also apply to Europe. And I think that what's true for Europe is also true for France. We find it difficult to get young people to participate in public life and in the taking of decision. And in France, there's a study which has just been carried out just a few days ago, and it shows that young people are very disinterested in public life and political issues. And I think that the causes, perhaps to a lesser extent, but are similar to those on the African continent. And I just want to explain what I mean by that. I think that it's a question of what you said, Bobi Wine, if I can call you that, and also what was said by Ms. Kenzani, who just spoke. I think that in Europe and France, there isn't really a space in which young people's voice can be heard. But I think in Africa, it's even more difficult, because you just talked about the point which I think is essential, is governance and the legitimacy of certain forms of democracy, and which has been indicated by international organizations. This is something which has been said by Ms. Kenzani. If young people in Africa aren't listened to, if they're not part of the decision-making process, then it's very difficult for them to be involved in actions. And I think that this is something which is very true for young people, but also raises the issue of legitimate democracy and governance. And I think before we start creating partnerships, it's important for the international organizations to be asking this at the very highest level. I mean, you were just making points. And I think if we want to make progress on our partnership, this is something what we have to do. I think in a way, what we need to do is reinvent in a contemporary way what we know. And what I like is a specific forum for young people, for their voices to be heard, and to create a link between the generations which have experience and those which have energy. We need these areas where people can speak and they can be listened to, because if they don't feel that their voice is being heard, then they don't want to participate in political life. And so it's a question at different levels. Legitimacy of representation, and that's something we have to listen to. And then the question of listening, because young people want to see results in their everyday life, but that's not what's happening in Africa or in Europe, in different member states. And so it seems simple, but it's actually very complex, because it's a global or holistic approach which is needed. That's the terminology we use here in Brussels. And so what I think would be good is to build this forum. We know that there are social levers. We talk about the autonomization of young people. We can have a cultural approach. We can have an economic approach. But if it's not clear, we can't do valid work in the area of the fight against poverty. Access to culture, access to knowledge, access to employment, access to activities. There are levers which to make sure that young people are part of the democratic process, but we need to make sure that the process is truly democratic. That's what we really need to look at first, and to make sure that it's addressing the largest number of people. And perhaps what's exacerbating things in Africa is, as you said, 70% of the African population is under the age of 30, and that amplifies the issue. And I think it's something we have to look at different levels. We need to look at the democratic issue, the legitimacy, and then the question of the tools, the involvement in social and cultural life. And I think that really is the basis for a new partnership, as has been launched by our commissioner, if we want to be able to participate tomorrow and to have reciprocity in terms of development on these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Eric, for such insightful contributions, especially the contribution that recommends that we have specific forums for young people to express themselves, spaces created within our democracies for young people to actually have a voice. And I think this is a very strong recommendation that we'll probably be discussing a bit later as we look at how to mainstream the youth voice. But it's also important that, you know, some of the institutional restrictions that are there to prevent young people from participating in the mainstream conversations that those institutional or procedural spaces are opened up. And I'm going to ask Manji, who's from Nigeria, to tell us a bit more about this. In Nigeria, we had the Not Too Young to Run youth-led movement, which was supported across Nigeria and actually received support from the EU as well. It successfully lowered the age of contestants to allow young people to be able to contest for office. Before then, of course, we had age limits to contesting for office and completely excluded young people from being able to hold national offices. But that has changed constitutionally in Nigeria, and that's as a result of youth political action. So Manji, are you aware of any other success stories of young people forcing themselves into the room and making sure that their voices are heard?
Thank you very much, Amara, for this question and an interesting discussion that is quite needed at the moment. Indeed, in response to your question about the movements that are being generated across, Africa, I think it is important to state, what some of the issues, are the dimensions to the scope of this issue. You had highlighted the issue of the leadership in terms of age and the gap between the average age of leadership today and the young population in Africa. But you also know that the World Bank and the UNFPA data has projected that by 2050, the current 1 billion population in Africa would be nearing 2.5 billion, with more than half of that population younger than 25 years. This is indeed reflective of some of the issues that have been highlighted, especially what Kensani was also talking about earlier, because we have a great, demographic shift across the continent, as well as an increase in digital communications, which has sort of galvanized, social activism and movement for young people. This you could all triangulate to specific examples that you're trying to highlight with the Not Too Young to Run movement in Nigeria. But there are other similar movements across Africa being coordinated, like in Zambia, we saw for their multi-party elections where young people galvanized and mobilized and turned out en masse, becoming more than 70%, of the voters on E-Day to cast their votes and make their voices heard. The Siasia place in Kenya has been doing, an amazing work. You can also see that while we have some of these positive efforts, you see the fees must fall, conversation in South Africa, the Yen Amari, movement in Senegal as well, which has been trying to serve as a means for young people to engage, their government interlocutors, because I think this is all about a conversation around, a place for everyone to be a part of the key decision processes of ensuring that governance work. Essentially, like you've mentioned, I think the link between, governance, and elections that Kensani was talking about, as a means of, airing the voices that we are not happy, considering what is being done in terms of governance management needs to be strengthened. The issues of social economic rights, the issue of provision of not just social safety nets, but economic opportunities, education, unemployment numbers being addressed, and certain issues that also promote migration, insecurity, and there are quite a barrage of issues. So this is not just about, a conversation on being on the table, but looking at the holistic development of the population of Africa, especially the young population. The young population is getting to a point where there is articulation of a common voice, on issues that borders on the development of the young person. And I think it is quite critical, and it is exciting to see that the European Union, beyond the commitments, of course, as mentioned by Commissioner Obilanen, talking about the Youth Sounding Board and other platforms, the African Young Leaders Program that is being promoted, that there are quite a number of efforts, even on the African continent, talking about mentorship programs, internships that could also afford young people an opportunity to not just air their voices, but to also practice some of these methods of leading, the population of Africa into, a particular platform or level that they intend to. So I think these are the issues that are really, generating a lot of the movements that you're seeing across the continent of Africa beyond the Arab Spring that started, early a couple of years back. These are just very, very critical issues, foundational and fundamental, that need to be given, critical attention to ensure that this partnership that is being envisioned and promoted within the next 7 years between Europe and Africa, yields, very positive results.
Thank you, Mr. Manji, for that very detailed intervention. Just highlighting the fact that not just political action in terms of getting in the room, but there has to be a holistic view of what you are going to do when you get in the room. That leads me to the next question, which I'm going to ask Bobi Wine about how, I mean, you have experience in political organizing, and from your experience as an opposition leader and a former member of parliament, what can you share about how some of the young political and social activists we're seeing rise all across Africa? What can you share from your experience about how they can organize their collective agitations into effective political structures that can have impact on election day?
Thank you very much. I've been listening to the submissions of various people, and I kind of have a feeling that I wish I was from those areas. Well, I speak from a rather peculiar view. I come from a country which is probably the youngest population in the world, Uganda, where we have more than 85% under the age of 35. And indeed, for the last 4 years, we have been banking on that, looking at that young population. We don't look at it as a liability. We look at it as a resource, especially if it's galvanized, if it's called upon to come together and make a decision together. And that was a reason why we started what we call the People Power Movement in Uganda, to call upon young people to get involved in the decision-making and then in the political dispensation of their country. And indeed, we were able to call upon young people who turned out in millions to vote to decide their destiny. Now, the challenge here is, unlike many other places, what is the response of the authorities? As I speak right now, we have thousands of young people in Uganda rotting in torture chambers, rotting in jails. Why? Because they raised their voices non-violently to say they want a leader of their generation. Like I mentioned, we have a military leader in Uganda, and I believe many other places in Africa, but particularly in Uganda, we have a leader that has been in power for 36 years, who came to power by use of arms, and indeed has used arms and force to crush all voices of dissent. We went to the polls in January last year, and people turned out massively to vote. Unfortunately, the internet was blacked out. The European Union and United States election observers were blocked from the country. I was a presidential candidate, But by the time we went to the polls, I was under military detention in my house. So this scenario makes every thought impossible. It makes all the ideas impossible. Now, being on this platform, I will also raise it that the international community is not innocent to this. While young Africans have aspirations and indeed have dreams for Africa, while they are first world brains stuck largely in third world countries, they have thoughts, they have aspirations, they want to transform Africa because they see what other young people are doing in the rest of the world. But because we have authoritarianism, which I don't tire to emphasize, then everything, every thought, all the intelligent ideas tend to hit a block wall. And like I mentioned, being on this platform, the international community is not innocent to that. Of course, the young Africans appreciate the voices that are raised by the international community in terms of statements. But the fact that the international community pours lots of money in terms of aid to Africa without following it up with calling upon the authorities in Africa and in particular in Uganda to ensure that it is not just business, but it is the values, the democratic values, the values of the respect of the rule of law, the values of human rights, then we are only going to be talking about this. Young Africans know where they want to go. They envision a future, but they are stuck in a world where they are crushed with brute force. Now, this is the elephant in the room that I believe we must address. Other than that, we are only going to be looking at the promised land where we want to go as Africa, but we won't be able to move our footsteps to reach it because we cannot fight against the American dollars. We cannot fight against the Italian bullets. We cannot fight against the donations from the European Union that are just placed in Africa and they're siphoned and are used in patronage and crushing of voices of dissent. Like I mentioned, right now, as I speak, I'm only maybe able to leave the country because I have international focus on me. But thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people are rotting in torture chambers and in prisons in Uganda. Why? Because they dared to challenge the authority of the strong men, in particular General Museveni, who has been in power for 36 years. Now, this is a case in many African countries. And until the world, until the international community, in particular the European Union, until they address that, until they call to order those authorities, until they make democracy, real democracy, a precondition for cooperation, we are going to be moving in circles. But when we have an opportunity for the international community to say, no, we are not going to be part of the criminality, then the voices of young Africans are going to count. Like I said, I really envy the young people in other countries that just decide not to vote. In Uganda, we actually long for the voting and we line up the entire day to vote, but our votes don't count.
Thank you, Bobi. Yeah, I'm actually very proud of the resilience of the Ugandan youth to continue to push their case through the process, even though there's, as you said, there's a lot of effort to make sure that that doesn't count. And you also mentioned that this is the case across many African countries. I wouldn't disagree with you, but I'd love to hear from other speakers as well. And Aisha is online, and I'd like her to weigh in on this. I don't even need to cite this, but during the Virtual African Union Youth Consultation Series in June 2020, that was during the pandemic, young Africans who gathered around to discuss the state of governance in Africa. They highlighted in many instances, many countries, this disconnect between young people and their governments, leading to distrust and a disconnection. And you know, it's even obvious in the frustration I hear from Bobi Wine here in the studio, who's talking about the fact that we are now looking outside our government, outside our processes, to see how our voices can impact our country. And so I'd like to ask you, Aisha, if you agree with that, if that's your experience, and if you can cite any other examples, so the audience know that this is not just a Ugandan situation. And have we learned any lessons? Is there any lessons for all of the stakeholders? Young people, have we learned anything from this encounter? Have our governments learned anything? Has the international community learned anything from this experience that we've had in the continent? Aisha, over to you.
Thank you. I will speak in French. Then, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak as part of this Africa Week. As a young person, I'm an exception for many young people, because young Africans like me who have access to education, for example, access to decision making, are very rare. In 2016, the Ibrahim Foundation issued a report, and the vast majority of Africans were under a certain age. There really is a big gap from 65 to 20. Based on this logic, it's very easy to forget that young people today are the adults of tomorrow. They were the children of the past, but it is these people who will be making decisions in the future. So it's not right to not take into account the opportunities that society can offer everybody. We don't stay young forever. We all have aspirations. Young people need to be listened to. And by 2025, 1 in 4 people in the world will be younger than 25, and that will be in Africa. This means that today we need to focus on building a resilient continent with sustainable development projects, so that the young people can become responsible adults in the future. We need an intergenerational partnership, co-leadership. We need to have a place at the table. We need to be responsible adults, but we also need to learn. We can't learn on the streets. We can't learn if we're always stigmatized, because there are barriers to young people's participation in progress, but also in decisions and lawmaking. Of course, we can make mistakes, and we have the right to make mistakes, because we need to learn from our mistakes. This needs to be a transition from the youth phase to the phase of adulthood. There is a decline in political engagement of young people, and young people are not voting, and we think that voting is the way for young people to participate. Governments and organizations have talked about this, but we need to stop with this discourse. We need to have action. We need to give young people opportunities to participate and speak. The lack of interest of young people in participating is seen as young people not being interested in it. No, but if we manage to engage young people and keep them as part of an intergenerational partnership, the transition between youth and adulthood with better methods, less bureaucracy, and it needs to be more efficient as well. This is what we need today. We can see what's happening in Africa. And the average president is 65, and the average age of the population is 20. There's a huge barrier there. There's a transition that we need to think about putting in place. We can say that the system needs to try to discuss these issues with young people and not leave them behind, because it's never the solution to leave people behind. You can't engage people by leaving them behind, but by saying they're not interested. it's not necessary to have projects if things only offer false trust, using young people for campaigns, for example. But when leaders are in place and when they have make many promises, young people don't see the politicians keeping these promises. We really need to create safe spaces. Policy needs to be inclusive, especially for young people. We need to work together. The other point of view in Africa relates to young people being excluded from activities, but the right to be young is about the right to be inexperienced, the right to make mistakes. It's the right to be taken into consideration. It's the right to be supported so that you can be a responsible adult in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisha, for that. Very, it was a broad take, but highlighting the issue of transition and the transition gap and the gap that we have to bridge in transition between generations is not just an age gap, but there's a learning gap, there's an education gap, there's a capacity building gap, and we should keep that in mind. And this is important, and I like the fact that the young people on this panel are setting the agenda for the continent and how this transition should happen. And for me, I think that also young people should manage this transition. They know what they want to see, want to experience in the future. And some of these policy recommendations about how this transition should happen, appear very sound. But I'm going to turn to Eric now and ask, because a lot of the speakers on this panel have highlighted the role of the international community. And I think that the international community plays a role in empowering young people. Just ask how the international community can step in on these issues, some of these issues that have been highlighted on this panel. What is it that's possible, and how can what more can be done to make the youth voice more influential in processes at home?
Je pense que, comme ça a été dit.
Well, I think, as Bobi Wine said before, the international community, and I told you I was going to maybe make some naive comments. I think is really responsible for what's happening on the African continent. There's a great deal of wisdom, and she's saying she wants to be involved, but we have to look at the context, and it's not appropriate. And so when we say that, that means that on the African continent, which is the richest continent in the world, and where we have a poor population, we have to look at the future of that continent. Is the international community wanting to see Africa become a democratic continent? And I think on the basis of what I see and hear, I think we really have to ask that question, and it's something that different people have been saying. If we, what you were saying specifically about Uganda, and I think these are the questions we have to ask. I mean, who's benefiting from this? And so I think that's why we have to look at the new types of partnership that we can build. We have a debate which is organized by the Socialists and Democrats, the Progressives. That's not by chance. We are progressive, and we believe in true partnership, and where we sit down together and we implement things and then we evaluate them. Now, if the international community had this wisdom, then perhaps we wouldn't be in the situation that we are. And now it's been over 40 years where there's been a liberalization, but where partnerships have disappeared, where there've been an increasing focus on individualism and concentration of riches for some poverty, inequality. I mean, that's what is happening. And so maybe what we need to do is look at the geopolitical model that we see today. And it's certain that there are problems of governance on the African continent, but there are also global governance issues. And I think these are the questions that we as politicians need to be asking. We can invent tools. There are tools. We can have councils for young people's council. We can have this at national level or international level, representative of young people. But if upstream, we're not really looking at democratizing the content, if it's not a legitimate representation, then it will just be fine words and it won't translate into reality. I think that what is being asked for by young people like Aisha is they want to see concrete things happening and they want to be invested in day-to-day life. And she wants hope and wants to see everyday changes. And that is what we have to invent. What we have to do, first of all, is carry out an evaluation of what I would say is a failure of the past links. We can't, we continue to tolerate the situations that we see. I mean, we need to stop talking about partnerships. These are just virtual partnerships. We need to look at the realities. And I think that there's been a failure. We need to look at that and we need to analyze why and come up with new types of partnerships. And I don't think that the Chinese or the Russians have new solutions for Africa at the moment. I think we have to look at our history, sometimes painful history. We have to accept the situation as it is now, analyze it, and come up with a true democratic vision. And I think that if we can do this with humility and focus on human development and these priorities, and I think we can then imagine a peaceful, serene future for the African continent and a different partnership. And I think that that really is the mindset that the S&D party has. We want to look at the limits of the models that we've had up until now. We need a new vision. We need a new partnership. And in that partnership, we need to look at how people develop and new types of partnership and make sure that these are the objectives and make sure that we're implementing them together and not think about a dominance or a dominant party and one that is being dominated. No, a true partnership of equals. And I think we need these groups where people can talk. And I think it's a question of getting people together to think, not one person thinking and telling other people what to do. And that's what we need to do. Get together, talk together, think together. And that's what I just wanted to add on the question that you asked me.
Thank you. I think that Eric said a few profound things, but I'd just like to highlight two things. First of all, redefining or expanding the scope of democratization. Because I think there's token democracies where you have elections and that's it, you know, but you don't take care to be sure that the voices in the elections are equal. But you know, I like the fact that you've highlighted that we need to move from just having democracy by elections to true democratization. There's equality of voices and that the governments that result from those elections are representative of the population. But also, you pointed out that between Europe and Africa, we need to transition to a true partnership, a partnership of equals, that we move from just talking about partnership to actually action about partnerships. And I think this is a good point to bring in Miss Kesani again from South Africa, because I mean, I heard from her earlier, she sounded a bit despondent and expressed how young people in South Africa are withdrawing from the process because their voices don't make a difference. And it highlighted the power asymmetry and the extreme power asymmetry between those who hold power in South Africa and in much of Africa as well, between those who hold power and those who don't. There's extreme power symmetry. And the thing about power symmetry is that, you know, nothing really happens unless it's acted on by an external force. So I'm just going to ask you, Ms. Kesani, if you think that the international community has a role to play in making your voice more influential in Africa. And if they do, what is most needed? Where is the most help needed in your situation? But also you can speak for the rest of Africa if you have that ability, Ms. Kesani.
So I think first and foremost, it's just maybe important for me to state this, that I'm a human rights attorney, and when you actually read legislation and you see how South Africa has international obligations, right, towards its citizens and everybody else that lives in South Africa, and when you look at the setup of human rights committees and how their recommendations are not binding, right, it makes it seem like there's actually no justice whatsoever. So even if and we report this to human rights committees, nothing will be done because they'll just say, oh, Mr. President, please be nice to these people. So I'm in civil society. We continuously litigate against the government to compel them to listen to the people and take them into consideration and actually implement their policies, but nothing actually gets done at the end of the day. So I also think that as Africa and Africans, we need to also try and look for African solutions for African problems. And that's something that could actually help. So I think getting human rights committees recommendations to be binding, like legally binding, with actual sanctions to be imposed on the actual country, I think that's a step in the right direction. Because we had COVID relief funds squandered by the government. People are even poorer. People have lost their jobs. People have lost everything. So if the international committee or international societies are helping South Africa with anything, there actually has to be policies in place and agreements in place to ensure that the money actually goes to the people that it said it's going to go for and uplift the lives that it's actually supposed to uplift. So I think they could apply the pressure in terms of that, putting the pressure that they need that monitoring and evaluation to be done whenever they get any sort of assistance. But also, I think it's also important to mention from what Eric was saying that relationships between South Africa or Africa and Europe shouldn't just be relationships of exploitation, but should be relationships that are to the benefit of both parties, that are equal, and actually achieve substantive equality, especially in the context of African people, considering where we find ourselves today economically and socially. So I think that's something that's very, very important. Having legislation or having committees and their recommendations to be binding, and ensuring that sanctions are in place if our government doesn't do anything. Also, I don't think there's anything wrong with actually imposing restrictions to say that at least 80% of people on certain forums, on certain committees have to be young people, right? And actually give them the power and the influence, because most people, like I'd be put as a Black female director of a company, but I might not be the one that's actually making all the main decisions, right? I'm just there as a face or as a trophy. So we need to find ways to do away with those kind of things, and that kind of narrative is that, yes, there are young people in our National Assembly, but what's their power? They're just there as a tick box exercise. But what's actually their power? What's actually their influence? And how far does it actually go? And also, how do we also strengthen civil society in our countries, right? Because if we are not properly or fully funded, we are unable to actually go head on with our governments whenever they fail us, right? So I think it's very important to just also ensure that there's support for civil society who are actually trying, whose their existence is to hold governments accountable for everything that they do, and ensuring that there's actual sanctions in place, and not just something where as it just affects one person, but also what is the impact of the actions or agreements that South Africa enters into? What is the impact on the people on the ground, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized?
Thank you, Kisani. So what I'm hearing from you is, sanctions, actual sanctions for actions that, affect abuses of human rights, but also things that suppress the voice of the youth, actions from government that suppress the voice of the youth. These violations should actually attract real sanctions. There's also the need to strengthen support for civil society, because that appears to give the platform for young people to influence policy as well. So stronger support for civil society organizations, particularly youth-led civil society organizations. And I think that was what was exemplified by Not Too Young to Run in Nigeria, that received support and were able to impact policy. So I'm going to turn to Mohammed Ravat, who's in the studio with us. He's a youth activist, and I would just like to ask you to respond to this debate.
Right. So I think before I say anything, I just want to say it's such a huge honor to share a platform with Bobi. I've just been listening to what you've said. It's quite easy for us to sit here in Brussels and talk about democracy. It's a very different story being on the ground in front of a military dictatorship and then pushing for those values. That is something. So I salute your determination. I salute your bravery. I salute your resilience. And it's an inspiration for all of us sitting here. It goes to show that if we're not careful, we could all slide into similar situations. So I think right at the outset, that's something that I wanted to say. Yeah, I've been listening to all the different contributions that have been given, and I'd just like to say, I want to reflect on quite a few of them. If we are going to have a smooth transition of power from existing leaders to the next generation, I think one of the things we need to address is we need to have a credible alternative. And that alternative doesn't just exist, it needs to be created. I think what we see with Africa is, there's strongman politics. So the leadership, the presidency kind of revolves around one particular person. We don't really look at the team that's under them. And if we want to have a credible opposition, someone, an opposition that's ready for power, an opposition that looks like a credible alternative to the public, then we need to create that credible alternative. And I think this is where the international community comes in. Because we need to go onto the ground and we need to look at the opposition parties, and rather than just creating one single individual who becomes the figurehead of a movement, we need to ensure that there is an entire team under there, that the moment they come into power, they are able to begin delivering almost immediately. So they need to hit the ground running. And this is quite important, because if we have an elections in one state, and if there is a change of power, and if the people of the eyes of the world will be watching when that transition happens. If it's not smooth, then it's unlikely that this will catch on. But if there's one successful example where there is a successful change of power and they're able to hit the ground running, then this will serve as a springboard in different states. So let's look at Zambia, where we had a change of government last year. President Hakainde Hichilema had been running for elections since 2006, and after many attempts last year, he finally made it through. It took about 3 or 4 weeks for his cabinet to take shape. So when I look back and I reflect at this, here is a man who had been in opposition for 16 years. I do feel that some of that time should have been utilized to have a movement that is ready almost immediately. But what happened is, over that entire period, the focus was on one individual, and that is how it seems to work in Africa. But what happens is, when you then come into power, you don't have that alternative structure ready underneath. So I think that the international community if we want to support change in Africa, one of the things we absolutely need to do is we need to start building that alternative. We can't just talk about democracy. We can't just focus on individuals. We need to ensure that there's a broader movement underneath. And I think this is a perfect time to capitalize on that. We're looking at what's happening in the Sahel region. Dictatorships are on the rise. And if we look at the reasons behind that, there's, Africans for many years, it's only been platitudes. We've given loads and loads of platitudes. We support democracy, we support this, we support that. But how much of that has actually trickled down to the public? And that's where, there's a huge frustration. And that's why we're saying, we saw in Burkina Faso when the coup happened a week or two ago, there wasn't a massive uprising. There wasn't that much sadness on the ground. There was some show of celebration, some show of support, which for me was quite frustrating. I felt like democracy has collapsed, and rather than the public, there being some sort of an outcry, these people are celebrating. And we need to understand the reasons behind this. So if we truly want to help Africa, reach its true potential, I think it's got to be a broader conversation. We need to do much more, and Europe especially. I think we need to really go back and realize that the way we left Africa, a lot of the problems that are there today, they are rooted in the manner in which we left. And Europe as a continent, as a people, we need to accept that we have, more than a huge part to play in fixing a problem that we created.
Well, thank you, Mohammed, for that very interesting contribution. I actually liked a whole lot of what you said, especially about shifting the focus from individuals to actually building structures and sustainable movements. I think that word, sustainable, is important. That's something that outlasts a single individual, that moves, if you incapacitate a single person, you don't stop the movement, because it has so many leaders. And I think that it's something that young people have started learning in Africa, of having leaderless movements, because they see how government targets the leaders of the movements. But I think that those kinds of movements may be difficult to support, but I think that we need to figure out how to support the broader kinds of the new kinds of movements that are emerging out of young people in Africa. So I'm going to talk to Bobi Wine now, because we're talking about young people getting involved. I also want to talk about young people supporting young people, because again, this is a conversation that's it's been happening in Africa. Young people coming to the polls and becoming candidates and so on. Now, assuming that we solve the problem of youth voter apathy, which, for instance, we've heard from Kisani in South Africa about what's happening with apathy. But assuming we solve that problem, how confident are you that young people can back young people? Will young people vote young people into office, or will we go back to a situation where we're bringing in people that should have transitioned to younger leaders? And how do we manage that? How do we navigate that?
Thank you very much. We have looked so much at the young people, but like one speaker said, that the young people of today were the babies of yesterday, and will certainly be the elders of tomorrow. We happen to be living in a generation where there's not so much difference in the minds, the young and the old, the male and the female. We tend to share understanding to look at things largely the same, because what is right to the young and to the old, and what is wrong to the young and to the old. So for the young people, it's just the numbers and the shared aspirations and the shared pains, but largely we look at the same wrongs and the same rights. However, allow me to go back a little bit and mention that while we are discussing the continent of Africa, especially from here in Europe, I would rather that we focus on the realities. It would be very naive for us to discuss Africa from the lenses of a comfortable European. Let's look at Africa through the lens of an African, and look at the Africa-Europe partnership and define it. Is it a partnership in crime or a partnership in the rule of law? Is it a partnership in democracy or a partnership in autocracy? Is it a partnership in good or the partnership in wrong? Is it a partnership in development or a partnership in underdevelopment? And looking at that, I think it's important for us not just to look at the leaders. Well, everything rises and falls with leadership, but let's look at the people. We look at the people of Europe and the people of Africa and look at them as equals, as human beings, and look at them as deserving the same standard of democracy, the same standard of human rights, and the same standard of respect for the rule of law. Of course, while we have progressive African countries like Zambia, which we look at so much, we look up to so much, countries like Botswana and many others, which we look up to so much, we